The morning sun cast long shadows across Broken Creek Station, a weathered wooden platform that served as the lifeline for the scattered settlements of the Arizona Territory. Once a month, the Iron Horse would thunder through this forgotten corner of the world, carrying supplies, mail, and the occasional passenger brave enough to venture into the untamed wilderness. Cowboy stood at the edge of the platform, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. At 43, his face bore the marks of countless storms and sleepless nights under star-filled skies. His dark eyes, framed by sun-carved lines, watched the approaching locomotive with the same careful attention he gave to everything else in his solitary existence. The train's whistle pierced the morning air as families gathered their belongings, preparing for departure. Among them, a young woman clutched the hand of her 8-year-old daughter, Emily, a bright-eyed girl with auburn braids who pressed her face against the station window, marveling at the approaching steam engine. "Stay close, sweetheart," her mother, Margaret, whispered nervously. "We can't miss this train. It's our only chance to reach Denver before winter sets in." Emily nodded, but her attention was captured by a small calico kitten that had wandered onto the platform. As the train screeched to a halt, passengers began boarding in a chaotic rush. The little girl, enchanted by the kitten, took a few steps away from her mother's side. "Emily!" Margaret called out, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of hissing steam and shouting conductors. Cowboy noticed the commotion immediately. His years of reading the land and its dangers had taught him to spot trouble before it fully formed. He watched as the young mother frantically searched the crowd, calling her daughter's name with increasing desperation. Meanwhile, Emily had followed the kitten around the corner of the station building. When she looked up, expecting to see her mother's familiar blue dress, she found herself staring at empty wooden planks. Panic seized her small heart as she ran back toward the platform, but the train was already pulling away, black smoke billowing from its chimney. "Mama! Mama!" Emily's voice cracked as she ran alongside the departing train, her small legs no match for the iron beast that carried her family toward the horizon. Cowboy set down his coffee and approached the sobbing child. His movements were deliberate and gentle, the same way he'd approach a frightened colt. "Easy there, little one," he said, kneeling to her level. "What's your name?" Through her tears, Emily managed to whisper, "Emily Patterson, my mama. She's on that train. She doesn't know I'm not there." The weight of the situation settled on Cowboy's shoulders like a familiar burden. He knew the train schedule better than anyone. The next locomotive wouldn't arrive for 30 days. By then, winter would have locked the mountain passes, making travel nearly impossible. "Where was your mama headed?" he asked softly. "Denver. We were going to live with my Aunt Sarah." Emily's voice was barely audible. "Mama said we had to leave because the bad men were coming for Papa's land." Cowboy's jaw tightened. He'd heard similar stories before, families driven from their homes by corrupt land grabbers who used intimidation and violence to claim what wasn't theirs. The law in these parts was often bought and paid for, leaving honest folks with nowhere to turn. Station Master Jenkins emerged from his office, shaking his head. "Damn shame," he muttered. "But there ain't nothing we can do until next month's train." "There's always something that can be done," Cowboy replied, his voice carrying a quiet determination that made Jenkins step back. As the afternoon wore on, Cowboy learned more about Emily's situation. Her father had been killed 6 months earlier in what the local sheriff called an accident, but Margaret Patterson knew better. The Crimson Valley Land Company had been pressuring families to sell their properties for a fraction of their worth, and those who refused often faced mysterious misfortunes. "My papa wasn't clumsy," Emily said as they sat on the station steps, sharing a simple meal Cowboy had prepared. "He knew horses better than anyone. He wouldn't have fallen like they said." The conviction in her young voice reminded Cowboy of another child, long ago, who had also lost everything to the greed of powerful men. The memory stirred something deep within him, a pain he'd carried for over 20 years. As evening approached, Cowboy made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Emily," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to propose, "how would you feel about taking a different kind of journey? One that might get you to your mama faster than waiting for the next train?" The little girl's eyes widened with hope. "You mean it? You'd help me find her?" "I give you my word," Cowboy replied, extending his calloused hand. "But I need you to understand, it won't be easy. The trail to Denver is long and dangerous, especially this time of year. There are men out there who might try to hurt us, and weather that could turn deadly without warning." Emily didn't hesitate. She placed her small hand in his, her grip surprisingly firm. "I'm not afraid, mister. Not if you're with me." That night, as Emily slept on a makeshift bed in the station's waiting room, Cowboy stood guard by the window. He studied the stars, reading the sky like a map of possibilities and dangers. Tomorrow they would begin a journey that would test every skill he'd learned in his 43 years of life. But something nagged at him, a feeling that their departure hadn't gone unnoticed. Earlier, he'd spotted two men in expensive suits watching the station from across the street. They disappeared when he'd looked directly at them, but their presence left him uneasy. As the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, Cowboy gently woke Emily. "Time to go, little one. We've got a long road ahead." Neither of them noticed the telegraph message that had been sent from Broken Creek Station late the night before, or the fact that their journey was already being tracked by forces far more dangerous than the wilderness they were about to enter. The hunt had begun, and Cowboy and Emily were about to discover that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from the wild frontier, but from the civilized world they're trying to reach. 3 days into their journey across the unforgiving Arizona desert, Cowboy and Emily had settled into a rhythm of survival. They traveled during the cooler hours of dawn and dusk, resting during the scorching midday heat beneath whatever shade they could find. Emily had proven herself to be remarkably resilient, never complaining about the hardships despite her young age, but their peaceful progress was about to be shattered. As they approached the small trading post of Copper Ridge, Cowboy noticed something that made his blood run cold. Wanted posters bearing his likeness were nailed to every post and building, with bold letters proclaiming, "Wanted, child abductor, $500 reward, dead or alive." "Stay close and keep your head down," he whispered to Emily as they entered the settlement. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Sheriff Wade Morrison, a man whose badge carried more weight than his conscience, stepped out of the saloon with 2 deputies flanking him, his cold eyes fixed on Cowboy with the predatory gaze of a man who saw dollar signs instead of justice. "Well, well," Morrison drawled, his hand resting on his gun. "If it ain't the child-stealing drifter himself. You picked the wrong territory to run to, stranger." Cowboy's mind raced. He could see the setup clearly now. Someone with money and influence had orchestrated this manhunt, painting him as a criminal to cover their own tracks. The question was who and why they wanted Emily so badly. "Sheriff, you're making a mistake," Cowboy said calmly, his hands visible but ready. "This little girl was abandoned at Broken Creek Station. I'm trying to reunite her with her family." Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the wooden buildings. "That's a real touching story, but I got a telegram from some very important folks in Denver. Says you kidnapped this here girl from her rightful guardians." Emily stepped forward, her young voice clear and strong. "That's not true. This man saved me. My mama was on the train and—" "Quiet, child," Morrison snapped. "You've been through a terrible ordeal. These criminals can be very convincing." The crowd that had gathered began to murmur, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and bloodlust. Cowboy recognized the look. He'd seen it before in towns where justice was decided by whoever had the loudest voice or the deepest pockets. "I'll tell you what," Morrison continued, his smile never reaching his eyes. "You hand over the girl peaceful-like, and maybe I'll let you ride out of here with just a beating. Keep fighting, and you'll be dancing at the end of a rope before sunset." Cowboy's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his gun, but he stopped when he felt Emily's small fingers grip his jacket. He couldn't risk a gunfight with her so close, not against 3 armed men in the middle of a hostile crowd. "I need proof," Cowboy said. "Show me the telegram. Show me who's claiming this child." Morrison's expression darkened. "You're in no position to make demands, stranger." But Emily had heard enough. With the fearless honesty that only children possess, she stepped into the center of the crowd and began to speak. "My name is Emily Patterson," she announced, her voice carrying despite her small stature. "My papa was killed by bad men who wanted our land. My mama and I were running away to Denver when I got left behind at the train station. This cowboy found me crying and promised to help me find her." The crowd began to shift uncomfortably. Emily's sincerity was evident to anyone with eyes to see, but Morrison wasn't about to let facts interfere with his payday. "The child's been brainwashed," he declared. "These kidnappers are clever that way." It was then that an unexpected ally emerged from the crowd. Doc Henley, the town's physician, stepped forward with a grave expression. "Sheriff, I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I know a traumatized child when I see one. This little girl shows no signs of abuse or coercion. In fact, she seems remarkably well cared for." Morrison's face flushed red. "Doc, you'd best mind your own business." "A child's welfare is everyone's business," Doc Henley replied firmly. "And I'm telling you, something doesn't smell right about this whole situation." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Cowboy could see that Morrison was losing control of the crowd, and desperate men often made dangerous decisions. He needed to act before the situation exploded into violence. "Sheriff," Cowboy said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced death many times and lived to tell about it, "I propose a compromise. Send a telegram to the station master at Broken Creek. He'll confirm our story. In the meantime, Doc Henley can examine Emily and verify that she's unharmed." Morrison's eyes narrowed. He knew that any investigation would expose the lies behind the wanted posters, but he also knew that backing down now would make him look weak in front of the townspeople. "Fine," he snarled, "but you're staying locked up until we get answers. And if this turns out to be some kind of trick, it won't be," Cowboy replied calmly. As they were escorted to the jail, Emily whispered, "Are we in trouble?" "No, little one," Cowboy replied softly. "Sometimes doing the right thing looks like trouble to folks who've forgotten what right means, but the truth has a way of coming out." That night, locked in the small jail cell, Cowboy and Emily huddled together as a desert storm raged outside. Lightning illuminated the barred windows, and thunder shook the building's foundations. "Tell me about your papa," Cowboy said, hoping to distract Emily from their predicament. Emily's face lit up despite their circumstances. "Papa was the best horse trainer in the territory. He could gentle the wildest Mustang without ever raising his voice. He said horses could sense your heart, and if your heart was good, they'd trust you." "Sounds like a wise man," Cowboy replied, thinking of his own father, who'd taught him similar lessons before the world had taken everything away. "He used to say that some folks are like wild horses," Emily continued. "They've been hurt so much that they don't trust anyone. But if you're patient and kind, eventually they'll let you help them." Cowboy felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. This little girl, despite everything she'd endured, still believed in the goodness of people. She still had faith that the world could be made right. "Emily," he said quietly, "what if I told you that your papa's accident might not have been an accident at all?" The little girl's eyes grew serious. I already know that. Mama told me before we left. She said the Crimson Valley Land Company wanted our ranch, and when Papa wouldn't sell, they made sure he couldn't say no anymore. The pieces began to fall into place in Cowboy's mind. The wanted posters, the sheriff's eagerness to arrest him, the mysterious telegram from Denver, it all pointed to one conclusion. The Crimson Valley Land Company wasn't just after the Patterson Ranch. They were trying to eliminate any witnesses to their crimes, including an 8-year-old girl who might one day testify against them. As the storm continued to rage outside, Cowboy made a silent vow. He would get Emily to safety, no matter the cost. But first, he needed to figure out how to escape from a jail cell in a town where the law itself had been bought and paid for. The answer came with the dawn, in the form of an unexpected visitor who would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. The dawn brought more than just sunlight to the jail cell in Copper Ridge. It brought Martha Henley, Doc Henley's wife, carrying a tray of breakfast and news that would shake Cowboy to his very core. "Eat up," she said quietly, passing the food through the bars. "And listen carefully. My husband sent that telegram to Broken Creek last night, and the response came back this morning. The station master confirmed your story completely." Cowboy felt a surge of relief, but Martha's expression remained grave. "There's more," she continued, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Sheriff Morrison received another telegram early this morning. It was from someone claiming to be Emily's legal guardian, a man named Silas Blackwood." The name hit Cowboy like a physical blow. His face went pale, and his hands began to tremble slightly. Emily noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked, her young voice filled with concern. Martha continued, unaware of the bombshell she'd just dropped. "This Blackwood fellow claims he's Emily's uncle, and he's demanding that Morrison hold you both until he can arrive to collect her. He's offering an additional $1,000 for your cooperation." Cowboy's mind reeled. Silas Blackwood, the name he'd tried to forget for 23 years. The man who'd destroyed his family, stolen his father's ranch, and left a young boy with nothing but hatred and a burning desire for revenge. "Ma'am," Cowboy said, his voice barely steady, "did this telegram mention where Mr. Blackwood was sending it from?" "Denver," Martha replied. "He claims to be a prominent businessman there." Emily looked between them, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "I don't have an uncle named Silas," she said firmly. "Mama never mentioned anyone by that name." Cowboy closed his eyes, the weight of the past crashing down on him. 23 years ago, he'd been a 15-year-old boy named Thomas Brennan, son of a successful rancher in Colorado. Silas Blackwood had been his father's business partner, a man they'd trusted like family, until the night Blackwood had framed Thomas's father for cattle rustling and watched him hang from the town's old oak tree. Young Thomas had tried to speak up, to tell the truth about Blackwood's crimes, but who would believe a grieving boy over a respected businessman? Blackwood had made it clear that if Thomas ever tried to expose him, he'd end up like his father. So the boy had fled into the wilderness, eventually becoming the man known only as Cowboy, a drifter with no past and no ties to bind him. Now, after more than 2 decades, fate had brought Silas Blackwood back into his life. But this time, it wasn't just about revenge. Emily's life hung in the balance, and Cowboy finally understood the true scope of what they were facing. "Mrs. Henley," he said urgently, "I need you to listen very carefully. Emily is in terrible danger, more than you know. This man Blackwood, he's not her uncle. He's the one behind her father's murder, and he wants her dead because she's the only witness to his crimes." Martha's eyes widened. "But why would he claim to be her guardian?" "Because it's the perfect cover," Cowboy explained. "If he can get legal custody of her, he can take her somewhere remote and make her disappear. No one would question a guardian traveling with his ward. Emily's face had gone pale as she began to understand the implications. He killed my papa? Cowboy knelt beside her, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. Emily, I need to tell you something about myself. My real name is Thomas Brennan, and 23 years ago Silas Blackwood murdered my father too. The little girl's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of understanding. That's why you helped me, she whispered, because you know what it feels like. Yes, Cowboy admitted, but also because it's the right thing to do, and because I won't let him hurt another innocent family. Martha had been listening with growing alarm. What can we do? Morrison won't listen to reason, especially not with that much money involved. We need to get out of here before Blackwood arrives, Cowboy said. How long do we have? The telegram said he'd be here by tomorrow evening, Martha replied. He's taking the train to Flagstaff and then riding hard. Cowboy's mind raced through possibilities. The jail was solid, but not impregnable. The real challenge would be getting out of town without being caught. Morrison would have men watching every road. Mrs. Henley, does your husband still have that old mine shaft behind your house? The one that connects to the creek? Martha nodded slowly. Yes, but it's been abandoned for years. It's dangerous. Not as dangerous as staying here, Cowboy replied. Can you get us some supplies, food, water, warm clothes for Emily? I can try, but… Martha! Doc Henley's voice called from outside. Morrison's coming this way and he looks angry. Martha quickly gathered the breakfast tray. I'll do what I can, she whispered, but be ready to move fast. As she left, Cowboy turned to Emily. Little one, I need you to be very brave. We're going to have to do some dangerous things to get you to safety. Emily straightened her shoulders with a determination that reminded Cowboy of her father. I'm ready. But Thomas, can I call you Thomas now? You can call me whatever feels right, he replied, surprised by how good it felt to hear his real name spoken aloud after so many years. Thomas, she said seriously, when we get to Denver and find my mama, are you going to stay with us? The question caught him off guard. For 23 years, he'd lived as a man without attachments, without a future beyond the next sunrise. But looking into Emily's trusting eyes, he realized that something fundamental had changed inside him. We'll see, he said softly. First, we need to make sure you're safe. That afternoon, Sheriff Morrison visited their cell with news that made Cowboy's blood run cold. Well, stranger, looks like your luck's run out, Morrison said with a cruel smile. Mr. Blackwood sent another telegram. He's not waiting until tomorrow. He's riding through the night. He'll be here by dawn. As Morrison walked away, laughing at his own perceived cleverness, Cowboy felt the walls closing in. They had less than 12 hours before Silas Blackwood arrived to claim Emily. 12 hours to escape, to disappear into the wilderness, and to somehow get a little girl safely across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. But as the sun set over Copper Ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Cowboy felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Hope. Not just for revenge against the man who'd destroyed his family, but for the possibility of building something new, something worth fighting for. The ghost of Thomas Brennan was about to rise from the ashes, and this time he wouldn't run from Silas Blackwood. This time he would stand and fight, not just for justice, but for the future of a little girl who'd reminded him what it meant to have something worth protecting. The escape would begin at midnight, but the real battle for Emily's life was just beginning. Midnight came with a whispered promise of freedom. Doc Henley's key turned silently in the lock, and Martha stood guard as Cowboy and Emily slipped from their cell into the desert darkness. The abandoned mine shaft behind the Henley house led to a network of tunnels that emerged near the creek, a mile outside of town. The horses are waiting by the old cottonwood, Doc whispered. Supplies are in the saddlebags. Godspeed, Thomas Brennan. Hearing his real name spoken with respect rather than fear gave Cowboy strength as they made their way through the underground passage. Emily's small hand gripped his tightly, her trust absolute, despite the danger surrounding them. They emerged into a star-filled night, the desert air crisp and clean. 2 horses waited as promised, a sturdy mare for Emily and a powerful stallion that reminded Cowboy of the horses his father had once raised. For a moment, the past and present seemed to merge, giving him clarity about what needed to be done. "Where are we going?" Emily asked as they mounted up. "To catch a train," Cowboy replied, "but not the one Blackwood expects." Their destination was Prescott Junction, a larger town 50 miles north where the main railroad line ran daily trains to Denver. If they could reach it before Blackwood discovered their escape, they might have a chance. But the journey would take them through Apache territory and across terrain that had claimed the lives of many experienced travelers. As they rode through the night, Cowboy told Emily more about his past, about his father's ranch, about the night everything changed, and about the years he'd spent running from his own name. "Why didn't you ever try to prove the truth?" Emily asked. "I was young and scared," Cowboy admitted, "and Blackwood was powerful. He had judges and sheriffs in his pocket. I thought if I just disappeared, maybe he'd leave me alone. But he didn't, did he? He kept hurting people." "Yes," Cowboy said quietly, "and that's something I'll have to live with. If I'd been braver back then, maybe your father would still be alive." Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My papa used to tell me that you can't change yesterday, but you can choose what tomorrow looks like. Maybe this is your chance to choose." Her wisdom, so profound from someone so young, struck Cowboy like lightning. She was right. This wasn't just about getting Emily to safety. It was about finally standing up to the man who'd cast a shadow over his entire adult life. Dawn found them at a water hole, resting the horses and sharing a simple breakfast. That's when they heard the sound of approaching riders, at least 6 men, moving fast and with purpose. "Blackwood's men," Cowboy said grimly. "He must have discovered our escape and sent trackers ahead." They had perhaps 10 minutes before the riders reached their position. Cowboy's mind raced through options, each one more desperate than the last. Then he spotted something that made him smile. A narrow canyon that led up into the rocks, barely wide enough for a horse and rider. "Emily, do you trust me?" he asked. "With my life," she replied without hesitation. "Then hold on tight. We're going to do something very dangerous." They rode hard into the canyon, the walls closing in around them as the sound of pursuit grew louder. The passage twisted and turned, leading ever upward until they emerged onto a high plateau overlooking the desert below. From their vantage point, they could see Blackwood's men searching the area around the waterhole. But more importantly, they could see something else, a thin line of smoke on the horizon that marked the passage of a train. "The morning express to Denver," Cowboy said. "If we can reach the tracks before it passes." They rode like the wind across the plateau, racing against time and the relentless pursuit behind them. Emily proved herself to be a natural rider, staying low in the saddle and moving with her horse as if they were one creature. The sound of the approaching train grew louder as they descended toward the railroad tracks. Behind them, Blackwood's men had found their trail and were closing fast. It would be close, too close. As they reached the tracks, Cowboy could see the locomotive approaching, black smoke billowing from its stack. He also saw something that made his heart sink, Silas Blackwood himself, riding at the head of his men, his face twisted with rage and determination. "Thomas Brennan!" Blackwood's voice carried across the desert. "You can't run forever, boy! Give me the girl, and I might let you live!" Cowboy helped Emily down from her horse and positioned himself between her and the approaching riders. Stay behind me, little one. No matter what happens, when that train stops, you get on it. What about you? Emily asked, tears streaming down her face. I'll be right behind you, Cowboy lied, knowing that someone had to delay Blackwood long enough for her to escape. The train was slowing now, the engineer having spotted the commotion ahead. Steam hissed from the brakes as the locomotive ground to a halt just yards from where they stood. Blackwood and his men thundered toward them, guns drawn. But as they closed the distance, something unexpected happened. The train's passenger cars began disgorging their occupants, and among them was a woman with auburn hair who looked remarkably like Emily. "Mama!" Emily screamed, breaking away from Cowboy's protection. Margaret Patterson had never made it to Denver. Consumed with worry about her missing daughter, she'd convinced the conductor to stop at every station along the route, searching for any sign of Emily. When word reached her about a little girl being held in Copper Ridge, she'd immediately boarded the return train. The reunion between mother and daughter was interrupted by Blackwood's arrival. He pulled his horse to a stop, his face a mask of fury as he realized his carefully laid plans were crumbling. "Silas Blackwood," Cowboy said, stepping forward. "It's been a long time." Recognition dawned in Blackwood's eyes. "Thomas Brennan. I should have killed you 23 years ago." "Yes," Cowboy replied calmly. "You should have, because now everyone's going to know the truth." What Blackwood didn't know was that Margaret Patterson had brought more than just maternal love on her journey. She'd brought a Denver newspaper reporter who'd been investigating the Crimson Valley Land Company's illegal activities and a federal marshal who'd been building a case against Blackwood for months. As the truth came pouring out, Emily's testimony about her father's murder, Cowboy's account of his own family's destruction, and the reporter's documentation of Blackwood's crimes, the man who'd seemed so powerful suddenly looked very small and very old. The federal marshal placed Blackwood under arrest as his hired guns melted away into the desert, unwilling to face federal charges for a man who could no longer pay them. "It's over," Margaret said, holding Emily close. "It's finally over." But Emily looked up at Cowboy with concern. "What happens now? Where will you go?" Cowboy knelt beside her, his weathered face soft with emotion. "Well, little one, I was thinking maybe it's time I stopped running. Maybe it's time I found a place to call home." Margaret stepped forward, her eyes bright with tears. "Thomas Brennan, you saved my daughter's life. You brought her back to me when I thought I'd lost her forever. If you're looking for a home, you'll always have one with us." As the train prepared to depart for Denver, carrying them all toward a new beginning, Emily slipped her small hand into Cowboy's calloused one. "Papa always said that some folks are like wild horses," she said. "They've been hurt so much they don't trust anyone. But if you're patient and kind, eventually they'll let you help them." Cowboy smiled, feeling the last of his walls crumble away. "And what did your papa say happens then?" Emily grinned, her face bright with joy and possibility. "Then they're not wild anymore. They're family." As the train pulled away from that desolate stretch of track, carrying them toward Denver and a future none of them could have imagined, Cowboy, Thomas Brennan, finally understood what his father had tried to teach him all those years ago. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't in running toward danger, but in allowing yourself to be saved by the love of others. The little girl who'd been left behind at a forgotten station had found her way home. And in saving her, a lonely cowboy had discovered that redemption wasn't something you earned through suffering. It was something you accepted through grace. In the distance, the desert stretched endlessly under an azure sky, but for the first time in 23 years, Thomas Brennan wasn't looking back. He was looking forward, toward a tomorrow filled with the laughter of a little girl who taught him that family isn't just about blood, it's about the people who choose to stand by you when the whole world seems against you. The train whistle echoed across the wilderness, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings and the hope that even the most broken hearts can be made whole again. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.